Hello, my name is Greg Kruger, and I'm the Cropping Systems Specialist at the West Central Research and Extension Center in North Platte, the University of Nebraska. I'd like to recognize Lowell Sandell, my weed science counterpart in Lincoln in the Agronomy and Horticulture Department, University of Nebraska. Today, I'm going to talk to you about herbicide-resistant weeds and give an update on the resistant weed species to be watching for in the state of Nebraska. In order to understand the current status of herbicide resistance in the state of Nebraska, as well as nationally, it's important to understand the timeline of herbicide use and herbicide resistance evolution. Herbicides were first introduced in 1945. The first chemical herbicide introduced to the market was the product 2,4-D. Early on, it was thought that chemicals would solve weed management problems. And to a large extent, we found that it really has eliminated the stress or the cumbersome labor involved in weed control practices. However, by 1957, we had the first reported herbicide-resistant weed to a chemical compound. This was the spreading dayflower, reported in Hawaii, and was reported resistant to 2,4-D. While agronomically that may not be too disconcerting to most of our growers in the Midwest, it does represent the first time where something like this could possibly happen. Now, if we fast forward in time and move to 1996, we saw the introduction of the Roundup Ready soybean. A lot of people thought when this first hit the market that resistance to glyphosate would never happen, and this was really great news because Roundup has a broad spectrum weed control. We could spray it over the top of the soybeans and we would have great weed control of all other weed species out there. Shortly after that, we had the introduction of Roundup Ready corn in 1998, as well as Roundup Ready cotton. Just 4 short years after the introduction of Roundup Ready soybean, we saw the first glyphosate-resistant broadleaf weed in the U.S. This particular weed species, horseweed or marestail, reported in Delaware. This particular weed species was found in a cropping system where a grower had utilized the Roundup Ready technology 4 years in a row, using nothing but glyphosate as the weed control agent in that field. The extreme selection pressure is what led to the resistance. Now, unfortunately, for post-emergence control of broadleaf weed species in Roundup Ready systems, the best option is glyphosate, followed by additions of ALS inhibitors. The first reported glyphosate and ALS-resistant horseweed species was found just 3 short years after that in Ohio. Today, greater than 18 states have reported glyphosate-resistant horseweed, and it likely appears many more states than that, just has not yet been reported. Now, it was thought that the addition of glyphosate-resistant trait to the market would help us manage glyphosate-resistant weeds. And while that's certainly true, if we continue to abuse the system and add excessive selection pressure for glyphosate, we're going to run into the same problems that we ran in with the glyphosate-resistant system. Continual use of a single product to manage the weeds is going to lead to great selection pressure for resistance in weed species in the glyphosate-resistant system as well. It's important to make sure that we maximize our product's lifespan by adding tank mixes, by rotating herbicide mode of action, and by rotating crops. In 2012, 13, 14, 15, or 16, we're going to see the addition of other traits, potentially ALS, Glyphosate, Dicamba, 2,4-D, and even HPPD-resistant traits introduced into the market. These products are going to give us new tools to try to solve problems created by glyphosate-resistant weed species. However, if continued to be abused, much like the glyphosate-resistant system, we'll see resistance to these different compounds as well. Like I said on the previous slide, it's important to make sure that we maximize our resistance management plan. In order to do this, it's important to ensure that we have tank mixes of multiple effective modes of action. Make sure that we use herbicide rotation whenever possible, rotating multiple different herbicide modes of action. Use crop rotation because the weed species that we generally deal with in one crop are usually not the most problematic weeds that we deal with in another crop. And then lastly, to alternate agronomic practices. For example, by changing planting dates, or by changing plant populations or row spacing, we can effectively manage some weed species. Here shows the number of resistant weed biotypes across time. Like we talked about, in 1957 was the introduction of the first resistant weed species. And resistant weed biotypes were very slow to accumulate until about the mid-70s. Today we see more than 300 resistant weed biotypes to a various number of different herbicide compounds. On this slide, we can see the number of resistant weed biotypes broken out by herbicide mode of action. The first herbicide mode of action to really show lots of resistance was the triazines. And you can see that the curve starting in 1970 and really in the mid-70s and early 80s grow exponentially to where we're at today with about 70 resistant weed biotypes out there to the triazine herbicides. This is due to the rapid adoption and extensive use of atrazine, particularly in our corn production systems. The second herbicide mode of action where we really see a lot of resistance, and certainly the greatest number of resistant biotypes today, is the ALS inhibitors. The ALS inhibitors were adopted in the mid to late 80s and into the early 90s, and we found that resistance occurred really quickly with this particular mode of action. Generally, 2 to 3 years of selection pressure would lead to resistant weed biotypes in this particular system. Now, the Roundup Ready system was introduced in 96 for soybeans and 98 for corn and cotton. At that point in time, we see very few resistant species to glyphosate in the blue curve along the x-axis. However, by 2010, we had approximately 20 weed biotypes reported resistant to glyphosate, and today that number is much, much greater. One of the first broadleaf weed species that we saw in the U.S. was marestail, or horseweed. The picture below in this slide shows a field with marestail infestation, and we can see that there are glyphosate-resistant marestail in this field. One of the first indications of glyphosate-resistant marestail is a segregating population. What we're looking at are plants that are completely controlled, like you see in the upper left-hand corner of the picture, plants that are partially controlled, like the one in the very center of the picture, and then plants that really show no control whatsoever, like the plant in the bottom right-hand corner of the picture. Glyphosate-resistant marestail has been reported in greater than 18 states, and it's one of those weed species that's come along with the no-till system. We know that managing glyphosate-resistant marestail is easy in a tilled environment because the light, small-seeded species really doesn't germinate below the soil surface. However, since most of our production in Nebraska is no-till, it leads us to the importance of using burn down, making timely applications, and using multiple effective modes of action to control this species. One of the best applications that we have for managing marestail in Nebraska is the burn down applications with a growth regulator and glyphosate, that being either 2,4-D or dicamba. The picture below depicts a field where we see giant ragweed. In 2011, we were able to confirm the presence of glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed in the state of Nebraska. Giant ragweed is one of the weed species that we've had problematic situations controlling this particular species, particularly in the eastern part of the state. The presence of giant ragweed in this field, absent any other weed species other than volunteer corn, suggests that there was probably a high likelihood of heavy glyphosate selection pressure without any other effective modes of action for controlling other weed species. Much like the marestail, controlling glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed predicates the use of multiple effective modes of action, and once again using herbicide rotation. This particular picture shows kochia. Kochia is one of the weed species that we've seen a growing number of complaints and growing number of concerns about resistance. And in 2012, we were able to confirm the presence of glyphosate and dicamba-resistant kochia populations throughout the state. Fortunately, we haven't found any populations yet that are resistant to both, but we do see populations that are resistant to either or. This particular field you can see also suggests a heavy selection pressure for glyphosate, where we have no other weed species in the field, and you can see a pattern of where that particular kochia plant that was glyphosate resistant likely rolled up through the field, leaving seed as it went. The following year, that glyphosate resistant seed germinated. Under the selection pressure of glyphosate, we had survival of that particular weed species, but pretty good control of every other weed species in the field. This particular picture shows the presence of 2,4-D resistant waterhemp, which was confirmed in Nebraska in 2011. And this particular picture is quite disconcerting considering the status of resistance to other herbicide modes of action in waterhemp and Palmer amaranth, a close relative to waterhemp, throughout the rest of the country. Now, fortunately, we haven't seen resistance to glyphosate, PPO inhibitors, or ALS inhibitors in the state of Nebraska yet, but it certainly doesn't mean that it's not there or that we shouldn't be concerned about it. By all means, waterhemp and Palmer amaranth have become one of the most grueling weeds in production systems throughout the U.S., and the addition of 2,4-D resistance on top of multiple other herbicide modes of action which we see resistance is just one of the most concerning weeds that we have in the U.S. today. So just to summarize real briefly, in order to manage these glyphosate, 2,4-D, ALS-resistant weed species that we see in Nebraska, it's important to use tank mixes, rotate herbicide mode of action whenever possible, utilize crop production systems, promote crop rotation, or alternative agronomic practices. With that, I'd like to say thank you both for your time throughout this presentation, as well as thank you to the Nebraska Soybean Board for their support of the herbicide-resistant weed field days conducted in 2012, as well as their support in the research that's ongoing in herbicide resistance.